And now, properly welcome everybody. Thank you all for attending this webinar. This is the first in a series of webinars organized by the Large-Scale Behavioural Models of Land Use Change Working Group. And today we're tackling the question with our speakers of, is the idea of large-scale behavioural modelling realistic? My name is Callum Brown. I'm one of the coordinators of the working group, and I'm just going to say a few brief words about the working group before we get underway with the webinar. This is a joint working group of the AIMS, Analysis, Integration and Modelling of the Earth System project, and the Global Land Programme, both of which belong to the Future Earth network. So the working group spans two projects of Future Earth and is open to all members with an interest in large-scale behavioural modelling in any respect. And we organise a number of different events throughout the year, this webinar series. We're also currently organising a special issue in the SESMO journal that some of you may be interested in. And you can join the working group or contribute to that special issue by following the links on this slide that's shown at the moment. One final thing to mention during today's meeting, you can ask questions to the speakers at the end of the presentations. You can also ask questions in the chat if you want to. Those will be monitored and raised at the end, and hopefully we'll have time for plenty of discussion. And to that end, I will now pass over to Tatiana, who's going to introduce today's speakers.
Yes, thank you very much, Callum, and welcome everybody. It is really a pleasure to open this webinar series with the two excellent speakers. They are not only the bright and the world-leading scholars in their own disciplines, but they also vividly represent the two pillars on which this working group and the international community around it is really grounded. The spatial modeling with the insights in land use patterns, and psychology with the insights in behavioral patterns and mechanisms that drive global environmental change and, of course, response to the challenges. And our first speaker will be Professor Elke Weber. So she's a professor of psychology and public affairs, and Gerhard Andüger Professor in Energy and Environment at Princeton University in the United States. And much of her work focuses on applying psychological theories to the real-world social problems, with particular attention to individual decisions that impact sustainability and on human environmental interactions, including climate change. And besides the fundamental psychological research on the development of measurement tools and scales to elicit main behavioral constructs that shape boundedly rational decisions, Professor Weber also develops two distinct research lines related to global environmental change. And one of her research lines centers around human decisions that are subject to influence of attitudes, social norms, perceptions, culture, institutional dynamics, and the environment. And another one centers on how responses to environmental policies are shaped and how can we actually design the choice environment in which we people find ourselves to actually enable the change in the behavior and hopefully sustainability transitions. Elke Weber is, of course, is a recipient of numerous distinctions, including the membership in the US National Academy of Sciences and in German Leopoldina. And she has a Distinguished Achievement Award from the Society for Risk Analysis and many other awards and honorary fellowships in Europe and the US. Without any further ado, I would like to invite Elke indeed to take the scene, and we all look very much forward.
Thank you so much, Tatiana, for the generous introduction. I just hope I will live up to it. Let me share my screen. It's going to take a second. I have a very old computer. Here we go. And so what I will be talking about for the next 20 minutes is modeling in energy and environmental behavior from the individual to the aggregate level. And in our discussions, we can tie that to your endeavor to apply that to land use decisions. As all of you know, we live in a time period that has been called the Anthropocene, to reflect the fact that it's human behavior and human decision-making, in particular with respect to energy, that is increasingly changing our environment, including our climate. one of the things that you can look at is models, of the effect of human behavior, models of decarbonization or models of land use. And when you look at most of the modeling or the scenario development efforts in that space, the question comes up, where are the people? Assumptions about human perception, about comprehension of current situations, of need for change, choices in that space are either missing or they're implicit. And the implicit assumption is one of rational updating, rational choice, homo economicus for short, infinite capacity, infinite knowledge. And perceptions and comprehension issues are mostly considered exposed, when policies don't work, when models fail or fail to predict all behaviors. And so the behavioral scientists come in at the tail end for the marketing end of things. It's indicative that it took 5 assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Only in the 5th assessment report in 2014, in a chapter on risk management that I was one of the lead authors on, was there the first mention even of non-rational decision processes. And so I think there's sort of 2 questions we can ask today. One of them is, how do all people differ from Homo economicus? What is that other species that we really are dealing with? And then the second one, I think that is sort of more the issue that sort of you were targeted for us today, is how do people differ from each other? What are individual or group or social, cultural differences, regional differences that we should consider? So let me just sort of summarize a few things about the other species, not Homo economicus, but Homo sapiens that we're dealing with. And some of those I will exemplify later on, others I'll just sort of touch on, and you can follow up if you're interested in those. And so one thing we need to know is that our decision makers who make land use decisions, who make other decisions that affect sustainability, are subject to finite attention and processing capacity. And I summarized some of those insights in query theory. We'll talk a little bit about prospect theory, which also is a response to this finite bounded rationality, finite processing capacity. But by and large, the scarcity of resources that we have give rise to myopia and to status quo bias, because if we have finite resources, we need to husband them carefully, and it makes sense in terms of evolution and survival to focus on the here and now, to focus on people close to us, ourselves. And the status quo oftentimes is a safe option. We've experienced it, and so therefore it's a devil we know. People have many goals, often conflicting goals. Yeah, we do have, of course, material goals and self-regarding goals, but we also have other regarding goals and psychological goals. We want to feel in control, for example. And what's important is that in this plurality of goals, only the ones that are activated at the time of decision play a role. And of course, that is also an entry point in shaping people's decisions. The other important insight over the last 30, 40 years is that outcomes are evaluated in a relative fashion. Prospect theory sort of very much, the band-aid on expected utility theory, if you want, basically very much says an outcome is considered as a relative gain, as a relative loss, and the reference points makes a difference. And given that we have different risk attitudes, we have loss aversion that are a function of whether we see something as a gain or loss, we can actually modify people's behavior by changing their reference points, very much compared to what. An outcome is not good or bad, but you have to know what people are comparing it to. We also learn best by trial and error, by getting hurt, rather than being told statistical summary information about sort of other people's experience, about statistical outcomes. Seeing very much is believing. And at the same time, we also are committed to our convictions. We are tribal species. We share beliefs, and our beliefs influence our reality. Believing also is seeing. So we really don't live in the same objective reality anymore. And in some countries like the United States right now, sort of that kind of polarization and tribalization is becoming quite more remarked, in part facilitated by social media that allow us to stay within our own bubbles. And the last point to make in terms of summary is we have multiple modes of making decisions. So yes, of course, we make calculation-based decisions, either in the normative way or in some shortcut prospect theory way. But on top of that, we also make decisions based on our emotions, based on rules of conduct, including social norms. And those modes oftentimes operate in parallel. And then the question is, if they lead to different outcomes, to different recommendations of choice, which of those 3 or more voices in our heads gets prevalence? Yeah. And so again, culture might shape which mode we favor in a given situation. So why incorporate realistic models of human actors into land use decisions or into other sort of large-scale decisions? Well, it's a negative in the sense that it introduces complications. So we no longer have a single way of predicting what a group of people, what a group of individuals will do in a situation, but there's increased uncertainty. And many of you have seen this paper by Beckett last year in Nature Climate Change that argues that uncertainty about human response introduces just as much uncertainty into our predictions, in this case about global temperatures in 2100, as uncertainties about the climate systems do. But at the same time, also having more variety in human decision making also is an opportunity. On the one hand, because we can explain certain phenomena that rational choice cannot explain, like the status quo bias, but also it introduces entry points for effective behavior change. If there are more ways in which people differ for different reasons, there might be more ways in which we can shape their behavior, in which you can induce effective choice architecture to modify and help them achieve long-term solutions, getting away from the myopia. And on those lines, the IPCC, the next report, now the 6th assessment report, has a standalone chapter on demand-side solutions, that focus on these entry points. Okay, I'm just going to give you a very brief history of psychological modeling of judgment and choice. We'll touch on sort of some historic papers and ideas and take you to the present. So psychophysics and Weber's law. This is not me. I'm not quite that old. I wish it wasn't my law. But it was Ernst Weber. He basically sort of noticed that in lots of sensory perception, there's a ratio of what we call just noticeable. So turning out the crank of a dial to make something louder doesn't require very much before somebody says, yes, noticeably louder if the initial point is very low, entry point, the starting point is low, but you require a lot more crank on that dial if the initial starting point is already very high. And so valuation is relative, and we know that neurons, in fact, encode change. We habituate to constant stimulation, and it's the change that we are responding to neuronally. And this gets back to the point that valuation is relative, not absolute, which of course was incorporated by prospect theory into expected utility theory. So what does that mean? So individual differences, now we're getting back to the notion about how do people differ, not how is everybody different from Homo economicus, but how do people differ from each other. In traditional economics, basically we have sort of two parameters, risk aversion and the time discount rate. But now if we sort of move to behavioral economics and include, for example, prospect theory, there are additional parameters. So we have loss aversion, how much more do perceived losses hurt us than perceived gains make us feel good. And in terms of discounting, there's not just a constant discount rate, but also present bias. And so a few years ago, I was working on some agricultural decisions. This was not so much land use, but choice of crops in Argentina, in the Argentine Pampas. And I don't want to go into any details on that, but we basically modeled people, the crop use decisions by both landowners and by land tenants who don't care as much about long-term sustainability of soil, either with expected utility theory or with prospect theory. And I just want to show you that sort of the predictions of expected utility theory, both for owners and tenants, are relatively constrained around sort of particular responses. Whereas if you look at the range here, this goes from 1 to 6, this goes from 0 to 25. If you introduce prospect theory, there's much more of a spread of responding. That's the main takeaway from that. Bounded rationality, which was of course proposed by Herb Simon in the 1950s, basically introduces cognitive constraints into our optimization models because of finite attention, finite processing capacity. And this is very much incorporated into query theory that I mentioned earlier, which makes the point that whichever option we consider first, that option has a sizable advantage for being chosen because sort of its benefits, its arguments are not being inhibited by subsequent queries. I don't think I have much more time to say about that, but I'll show you an example. So if you ask people, for example, choosing between a round trip ticket, airline ticket that has a certain price by itself, or that includes a carbon user fee, and you explain what the carbon user fee does and why it's priced the way it is identical for everyone, but half of the people see the user fee being referred to as a carbon tax, and the other half see it referred to as a carbon offset. And then you ask them, okay, how many of you would buy this inclusive ticket and how many of you would not? And afterwards ask them demographic information, including political party affiliation. The question about carbon offsets is attractive to everyone, regardless of political ideology. 62% on average choose it, but the same information being introduced as a carbon tax doesn't matter for the Democrats, but it's usually appalling to Republicans, the dirty word tax. They don't choose it. And you can show that that difference in choice across these different conditions is entirely predicted by query theory processes, which option gets considered first. And the carbon tax for Republicans is offensive, so they look at the other one and generate more arguments for it. Okay, the last point in terms of individual differences is, or also general human differences, is human abundance, multiple goals, where you talked about the fact that sort of only goals that are active at the time of decision are important. And the 2 points to make is that on the one hand, culture affects chronic activation of certain goals. So we know people that live in more collectivist cultures, sort of chronically pay attention to different subset of goals than people who are raised in individualist cultures, but also the choice context. Context broadly defined, it could be the chronic context, but also sort of the situational context that you can modify, affects temporary activation. So people, for example, in the United States vote differently on certain issues if the voting locale is in the church as opposed to being a public school, because the church evokes, again, situationally very different sets of values. And of course, that's where choice architecture and nudging comes in, by modifying the context, the situational context around the decision. Just again, I'm just going to flash this. There's a set of tools that have been proposed for choice architecture, and we mapped this with 13 experts on energy decisions, environmental decisions, on the kind of goals that they facilitate. And presumably, these slides and references will be available to you afterwards. You can sort of look at that. The last one is human abundance with respect to decision making. And decision modes. We already talked about calculation, emotion, and rule-based decisions. And emotion-based decisions can be positive, pride versus or negative, pride and approach versus fear and guilt versus avoidance. And in the rule-based domain, of course, norms play a large role. Descriptive norms, what is everybody else doing around me? And injunctive norms, what do authority figures, what do other people want me to do? And of course, then it's important to look at social influence and social networks. Who do people pay attention to? So now bridging social and physical environments into models of decision making. What are the obstacles to doing that? Of course, if you look at social network models, in the nodes in those network models that come mostly out of sociology are pretty simple-minded. They either imitate a neighbor or they use very simple rules of updating. And one thing that you can do by bringing more psychology into this is making the nodes more sophisticated. On the behavioral side, many of the psychological models of decision-making miss the influence of social and physical environment. They're fragmented over subdisciplines without a coherent framework. They focus on specific aspects of decision-making, and they vary in format very much from simple narratives to mathematical models. And so Maya was an inspiration to me and many others and colleagues. I think many of the other people on the call probably as well here, by having this Mohawk 1 framework that basically tried to remedy sort of the second set of shortcomings by coming up with a model, a broader model that incorporates more psychological theories into agent-based modeling. And then recently, Maya and Nanda teamed up with myself and Sarah Constantino to basically expand on this very impressive initial framework by Mohawk 2. Again, we're looking at a broader set of processes and incorporating those into these network models, identifying some sample theories. That paper, with any luck, will be available in a couple of weeks as a working paper. We're resubmitting it. And it explains sort of how to use this framework to ask different types of questions, either finding relevant theories for some phenomenon you're interested in, or comparing the benefits of different theories for this context. And so let me just sort of finish on the slide. When we now get to the domain of modeling land use decisions, what should we discuss in our last half hour together? I think one question we should ask ourselves, why do you want to do that? Why do you want to add sort of a behavioral component to land use decisions? Who's being served by that? It might be interesting for researchers, but does it also have sort of policy implications? So why, for what purpose, but then also how to do that. Obviously, beyond rational choice is what I've been advocating. And yeah, how do all people differ from Homo economicus? We talked about goals, we talked about constraints, we talked about processing. Are there additional features? And then sort of the question about how do we differ from each other? Are there too many degrees of freedom? And of course, sort of many of you and the second speaker have been struggling with that, trying to constrain those large combinations of differences to types. And again, when we talk about types, we have to ask ourselves for what purpose? And so for different purposes of these models, maybe different types are called for. And then, of course, that's not just the purpose that constrains the enterprise, also its availability of data and big data, because we want to do this at a large or ideally global scale. And then what are the methods and tools to do that? So let me end on that. And thank you for your scarce attention. I think I will stop sharing.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Elke. It has been very insightful. So we have, right, we thought how to do that. So, and we would like to ask you to hold on with your questions maybe after Peter's talk. And please feel free to post questions in the chat. Derek is going to manage them, and we will come back to the questions in some 20 minutes. And right now, I would like to invite Professor Peter Verburg to share maybe his screen and come with the talk. Of course, we are also very happy that Peter was available to talk and share his vision. So Peter is a professor of environmental analysis and leads the environmental geography group at the Free University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. He also holds the position at the Swiss Federal Research Institute. And I think most of you actually would know Peter because he was also the former chair of the Global Land Program of Future Earth and has made a major contribution to building the community and to inspire many early career researchers. Of course, also Peter is one of the founding fathers of land use modeling and the author of probably the most widely used land use model worldwide. And throughout your career, Peter, you of course has been developing many different innovative methods of analyzing and capturing spatial patterns of land use at different scales. And we know also that there is a range of applications to which you and your team apply those models of course, of coupled human environmental systems and ranging from ecosystem services analysis, urban-rural interface, climate change mitigation and adaptation, and sustainable cities. Of course, Peter analyzes patterns of land use both on the global north and global southern contexts, and actually pioneers in analyzing how human decision-making across the world is explained by local contexts. Peter's work is also distinguished by multiple awards, including the European Research Council grant, and you have published lots of wonderful articles. And of course, you are a highly cited researcher, so we enjoy a lot your work. And Peter, I would like to, of course, invite you to share your vision, and then Derek will take over with the questions.
Thank you very much, Tatjana, for a very nice introduction. And good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I think the organizers organized this quite nicely by exactly organizing without coordination that my talk will exactly follow up where Elke ended her talk. And because I will pick up from the notion of diversity in decision-making, and basically in the act of making a global model of land use, as we're doing, is the act of generalizing the diversity in the decision-making we find around the globe. We know people are making different decisions. They take different decisions, but in a model, we have to simplify that. And most existing global models are doing that too general. They just assume either rational behavior or one set of heuristic rules. Well, we know that all that diversity is there. We've just heard about this diversity. And just in terms of the different objectives people may have in their decision making, the different decision theories that may be able there to explain in the different ways we can model that. We have a lot of that knowledge. And Elke nicely summarized a lot of that knowledge from experiments, from theory, and also in terms of agent-based modeling techniques. We have a lot of different approaches of translating those theories and those knowledge into models. And in local case studies, we're good in doing that, either by doing behavioral economics experiments, doing interviews, deriving basically the rules of how differences between actors and agents lead to different decisions, combining often different types of data into a modeling framework, distinguishing different groups. And this looks very much like a standard local scale agent-based model where we have 3 different types of agents that have locations in the field. They can start interacting and we can start simulating what this means in terms of outcomes for land use, but also in terms of livelihood characteristics or a population composition. But how to do this on a global scale? How to know how people around the world, the millions and millions around, are differing in their decision making? To what extent we can generalize and what is the variation? And then where do the different types of decision making occur around the world? In building a global agent-based model, we have to know where in the world, what type of decision making is taking place. And going from that challenge, we are lacking a lot of data. There's few data that describe where people make, on what grounds, what decision making. So we took an approach to try to fill that gap, or at least seeing what we could get from the existing data that are there. So we basically started collecting large set of local case studies, place-based research towards land use change around the world. From behavioral economics, from anthropology, from geography, studies describing how people decide on making land use changes around the world. So we collected a lot of papers. In the end, we found descriptions for about 750 different decision makers at around 550 different locations around the globe. And because these studies have very different character, they're originating from different disciplines, they don't have all the depth and the nice quantification that Elke was showing on the real behavioral aspects, but they often document several aspects of the decision making. So we had to basically code all these different studies to a common kind of coding scheme to describe the decision making mechanism in those case studies. And we used a rather simplified framework, which uses a lot of the planned behavior theoretical concepts by basically by distinguishing in the decision making the ability that agents have to make certain decisions and their motivations being subdivided into their objectives and their attitudes, and linking those to the underlying drivers often mentioned in those studies and the actual land use processes being observed in those case studies. So for the different components of the decision making, we coded several aspects of the objectives, the attitudes, which capture certain elements that Elke was just discussing, the attitude towards change, the attitudes towards legislation, also the attitudes that people have towards environmental values. But also we coded very well the ability that people have, the resources they have, the land tenure security they have, the social connectedness they have. And a lot of the studies that we found are actually describing these factors in pretty much detail. So based on this coding of these elements, we could derive basically for each actor, each decision making described in the case study, kind of a coding of how important are these different factors. And then we tried to summarize those. Of course, each description is valuable in itself, but a lot of the things we are doing in agent-based modeling is often generalizing this in a couple of different clusters, types of decision making that we can represent in a model. So here also we tried to cluster based on these elements of decision making to kind of meaningful decision making types. And this is how that looks like. So the same on the circles, we see these elements of ability, the objectives, and the attitudes. And based on the clustering, we could identify different types of decision makers on land use. Now, the interesting thing is, it was a paper that took quite a bit of time, and when we were completed with the paper, it was already outdated. So we repeated a search on the more novel literature. And basically, the interesting element was that we found that the clusters that were emerging from our second set of data were almost identical up to very high level as the first set. So these types that were identified, even across two independent sets of literature, were pretty robust in our findings. And to show a bit of more detail, and this is then kind of what we call the survivalist, which is dominated by the objectives of the decision making are all aimed at survival. And we see that in terms of ability, these are often people with small land size, land ownings, little financial opportunities, and not a very high status of land tenure security, but a higher social connectedness. And we also see that they have modest attitudes towards change legislation and environmental values as compared to other types. So that's just an example of how we coded across these case studies these types. Now, this is basically the result that we got. So for all those locations of case studies around the globe, we could classify what type of decision making in terms of land use we were finding in that case study. Now, that looks pretty nice as a diagram, but this is not yet very useful for a global multi-agent model. And we know, and we basically already knew, that there is different modes and variation in decision making around the globe. But what we basically would need to know is, where do we actually find this? And now we took a step that was basically a hypothesis we had, that the mode of decision making, the types of decision making, will be very much determined by contextual variables. So what we tried to see is, can we explain this kind of distribution, finding a certain mode of decision making by broad characteristics, indices, proxies for the socio-economic conditions at that location, the biophysical conditions, and the climate and terrain conditions. Basically, we collected for each of those locations these contextual variables that we also have in spatial data sets, allowing us, if there would be a relation, to extrapolate these relations across space in order to be able to predict where we could potentially find a certain mode of decision-making represented by context. Of course, we were afraid of doing this because we know that human decision-making behavior is dependent on a lot more factors. But it was also a test to what extent can we explain this variation found around the globe by variables. Using standard econometric techniques for doing that, here we see one of the results basically on explaining the choice of finding either survival or livelihood objectives or more economically oriented, market-oriented objectives. And we found quite a lot of variables significant and a reasonable explanation of global patterns, which we could, of course, then translate into kind of the likelihood of finding a dominance of certain types of objectives in decision-making at a certain place. Now, we repeated that for the different groups of decision-making. And if you look now, you both see quite a lot across all the different types of variables, significant variables. But what is more interesting is to look at the level that we could explain the distribution of the occurrence of these modes of decision-making across the globe based on this pretty simple set of spatial proxy variables. And this AUC, which ranges between 0.5 and 1, showed that we could explain the spatial distribution surprisingly well. Context is very determining for finding a certain mode of decision-making at this broad level of decision-making. Of course, there's a lot more dimensions to decision-making, but at this level, we could explain very well, which allowed us to basically, for each of the modes of decision-making, map the likelihood of finding that mode of decision-making at certain places around the world. Now, by generalizing these graphs towards what would be then the most likely or dominant types of decision making at a certain place, we get this nice piece of art in terms of colors. Here we see in which location, which type of decision making, or which combination of decision making types. There's a couple of groups which are combined where likelihoods of finding two types were almost equally there. And this gives kind of a detailed pattern with even pretty interesting spatial patterns of differences across place. But you also see that we identified areas which we call as gray areas, low confidence areas. And that's also an interesting thing, because what you could do is to see for your case studies to what extent the conditions of those of a location around the world are represented by those case studies. And we find that certain areas like Papua New Guinea have are lowly represented for any of the types by any of the case studies. So we could identify areas around the globe which are poorly represented in terms of contextual conditions by the behavioral decision-making case studies. Those are these gray areas. And quite interesting, we see that a lot of areas in Central Asia are very poorly described by our land use decision-making case studies. So there we could not do any extrapolation of our regressions with any confidence in those locations. So it also tells us something about what is the evidence we have for variation in decision-making across all the case studies. And basically, where should we do new case studies to learn more about these decision-making processes? Now, for those interested, these results are described in two papers, the one doing basically the systematic review and the other one doing the mapping of this across the globe. Now, so does this allow us to basically model land use decision-making globally in a more nuanced way? Yes and no, because to some extent, these rough modes of decision-making can help us to take a step away from assuming the rational choice behavior all across the globe. It can help us to make some more diversity in our decision-making. But what we found is that in most of those case studies that we analyzed, it was all about the local farmers and how they make their decisions. Now, maybe this local farmer that lived in that house in the middle of the road also felt he had some decision-making power, but in the end, he's clearly losing out on his own decisions, because a lot of decision-making is not only happening by the primary actor that is deciding on the land change based on motivations and options, because those motivation options are determined by other agents in the game, either institutions that determine the rules or NGOs that educate decision makers by giving them information or training. And those actors, again, are influenced by others. In land use, there is a lot of nested and multi-level decision making, which often also we can refer to as land governance. Now, this whole issue of land governance is not very much addressed in a lot of models, not in the big global land use models, but also not in a lot of the agent-based models, because it's complex. And that results in that if we look now here, this is a global simulation of the IPCC model, integrated assessment models, that we see these kind of things happening, that a lot of reforestation here is happening, like in the Kenyan highlands, which are an area with a lot of smallholder farmers that would not be very eager to give their land to be reforested. So is this model assumption that this can be reforested a fair one? And we see this mistake of not accounting for land governance in a lot of things. If we think about initiatives in conservation or restoration, we often ignore the people in those places, while land governance deals with a lot of land is owned by local people. They have a certain level of decision power, but not all of that. And they are producing a public good, while the land is often privately owned. And this is a complexity that we are having to deal with in models. So if we think about these land governance aspects, we have to think about different components. There's the land tenure component, which we could capture to a certain extent in our systematic review, where we could code the security of land tenure as being linked to certain modes of decision making. But then there's also land use planning, determining by institutional actors, often determining what is allowed, what are the range of options a decision maker has. And we have a lot of influences by institutions, by NGOs, but also through social networks that enable, incentivize, or constrain certain actions towards the land. To put this in a bit of an actor context, we can see large groups in our agent decision-making context. We looked mostly at the land managers, and we see here, subsistence-focused farms, they often have kind of a large authority on their decision-making. But then if we look to already the more regulated smallholder systems or the contract farms, where value chain actors are having a much more governance on the decision-making than a farmer has in subsistence things. Because here it may be the supermarket or it may be the trader that determines to a certain extent how the land is managed to get a certain type of products. And then, of course, there is the development of larger scale farms, international land acquisitions, and other developments that change the role of agency in land governance. And we see a lot of dynamics there. We see that value chain coordination and changing control on land dynamics by these land markets and larger scale land acquisitions are overriding traditional land control rights. So we see a move in agency from individual landowners controlled by institutions of the states to value chain based control of land use decisions. And again, where do we find those things? And that's where we have even less data. This is a very short, simple review of case studies around the globe where we find evidence that contract farming, value chain actors playing a dominant role in the land use decisions are playing a major role. Not very clear spatial patterns and very small evidence base of case studies all around the world. For large-scale land acquisitions, we have a bit better information of where those are happening. Also there, we're still lacking a lot of knowledge about where they are happening and how that changes the overall land use decision making. And it's very unknown. While we know a lot about smallholder decision making, it's very unknown how decisions of medium scale, larger scale, and these large scale land acquisitions are made and how we would need to represent those in models. And then in terms of the institutional processes that impact on the decision making, we can distinguish a lot of different ones, which vary from very least stringent, as we call it, trainings to change the deliberate with farmers, that change the information base, to kinds of bans and moratoria that restrict the decision making because of a membership or a contract to a certain farm. So we have a lot of different mechanisms in that. So to conclude this talk, yes, we can include decision making in global models. We have a lot of theoretical knowledge. We have a lot of knowledge from case studies. We have some empirical evidence of what, how, and where. This case study evidence reveals global variations. So indeed, yes, we are not behaving like rational actors. There's enough evidence for that. And we know where more or less different motivations and different objectives are important to decision making. But the wider including of multi-level decision making is really needed. Land governance plays an enormous role in the decision making. And this is not very well captured in the base of case studies that we could use in our systematic review. And the empirical evidence of those roles of land governance is anecdotal often, or linked to a few case studies, but we do not have a clear basis for knowing exactly where around the world what's happening. Just as an example, the status of land tenure, data on land tenure security around the world is very unknown. Well, we know it has a huge impact on decision making towards land use. So there's still a lot of challenging work to do before we can take a step from our understanding of the behavioral psychology towards the empirical base, towards using that in global scale models. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Peter and Elke. That was an incredible talk from both of you. It was very exciting and a wonderful complement to each other. And I want to inform everyone that if you raise your hand, either visually or virtually, I will try and open the mic to you. And if you would rather add your question to the chat, then I will compile those questions and ask them on your behalf. And while you're all thinking of a few questions, our steering committee has come up with a couple, and I'll start off by asking one while everyone has an opportunity to think about their own questions. And given this really beautiful complement between the work that you guys have provided, I would like to propose that you ask, identify maybe where you would like the other speakers' work to go to bring it more in alignment with some of the challenges that you've faced in your own research that you've presented today. And maybe we'll go in the same order as the presentation. So maybe we'll start with Elke.
Great question, and not an easy answer, because I think Peter already has done so much that is very much needed. I mean, I wasn't aware of a lot of this work prior to giving this talk, so thank you for making me aware of this, because land use hasn't been high on my agenda, but obviously the techniques that you developed, Peter, sort of apply to many other decisions as well. And I think sort of what I like about it is so that you sort of fit the determinants of decisions into these broad categories that can be maybe defined in detail in different ways. But I think we sort of all more or less agree that it's sort of important to think about motivation. Why does a decision maker, that could be an individual decision maker or an institutional decision maker, why does he or she make that decision? What are the capacities, so the capabilities that constrain the decisions or enable different types of decisions? And then the last one, what are the values and attitudes and beliefs, so the long-standing sort of in individual factors or institutional factors that determine those decisions. So I think we sort of agree on those basic categories. I guess maybe sort of where we diverge a little bit, in part because of what we study, is sort of how to define the determinants within each one, the factors. And so I might be more interested in sort of the psychosocial, cultural determinants of motivation, or for that matter, capacity, the agency that somebody brings to the table, as opposed to sort of material constraints or the soil conditions. But I think sort of we all agree that they all are important, and maybe important for to slightly different degrees for different types of decisions. I think we also, I don't think there's so much disagreement. There's also agreement on, so if we want to take this enterprise further, we need more data. And then the question is, where will this data come from? And can we maybe enable or involve sort of global panels, like Pew, or McKinsey to start collecting these kinds of variables that we think we need, to make better predictions in regions around the world where they maybe haven't been collected very much. Or other big data providers, can we somehow entrain them in this collective enterprise, and what would motivate them? So I don't think I have too many recommendations about what to do differently. I think just you have to do more and maybe do more together.
That's great. Thank you, Elke. Peter, what do you think?
I fully agree with that. And I think you make very good remarks about, of course, our selection of variables was partly based, of course, on what is in the case studies, and partly based on trying to pull together some of the theories into factors that are commonly accepted, including these kind of attitudes towards change and things, to capture some of those aspects that are well known from behavioral theories. But in terms of your remark of trying to contextualize those things, to explain why we find those things, you're very much right. We would have loved to include these kind of elements. And I saw another question about that in the chat box on, can you explain about government transparency? A lot of these more deeper sociocultural factors there. But there we run into the problem that a lot of their on that there's no data available, or there's data available on a national level. And if we look at our data, we see this huge variation within countries that is there. So then explaining a local behavioral attitude by an overall national scale governance system or variable is not always very useful. We try to work with some data on where we have indigenous groups living and so on, but then the variation is so big and we don't have that so we are very much constrained by the availability of data. And then that's when you end up with trying to explain behavior by the pH of the soil. And of course, that doesn't seem to make sense but of course, on the other hand, the pH and soil conditions can be a proxy for the natural resource base that is there, which may constrain certain levels of development. But maybe to put it to a question back to Elke on, I think it's perfectly complementing these types of research, and we should all both do these things. But what I was fascinated by our results is that it is such an obvious story that we find. Basically, we find on the longer run is that if you're in very poor, distant conditions, your decision making is basically based on survival. That's your motive. You have little resources, little authority, and slowly you see that in a gradual way moving to large-scale commercialization, neoliberal decision making. It's the money that matters, and you have power is important in those decisions and all that. And then you see a sub-destruction to more lifestyle-oriented, agricultural decision-making, environmental things. But then only if people have nothing to lose, high land tenure security, good social connectedness, and so on and so on. Is that as simple as the world is? Or are we really missing very important nuances that would change the game? We can capture this diversity and deviate from just a rational actor, but is it enough? Or are those nuances, and you presented some in your talk, are they so determining the tribal attitudes of people that we cannot capture from those case studies? Are they so important that they really show a different trajectory of the world? Because what we show is kind of a classical pattern, which is not very exciting in a certain way, but still important.
I wish this was the way my PhD defense went, with this level of agreement and happiness amongst you two. I'm going to move this over to Wander Jager, who's got a question for you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for organizing this and making the Friday afternoon fun. Appreciate it very much. I was really keen in joining this meeting as I'm very interested in the topic. It is this year 20 years ago that Marco Janssen and I had a special issue on modeling human behavior in ecological economical systems, and I've also worked a little bit in the MoHub model now. So I would like to share a question, a comment a little bit, because I see one of the problems that we are facing with implementing behavioral theory and agent-based models is that most behavioral theories are based on correlational and cross-sectional research. And obviously, this is very valuable, but it does not provide the causations that are needed if you really want to implement it in a causal computational model. And in doing that, it's really very difficult because you are being confronted with very nasty questions. And I think Tatjana can confirm that, because she implemented in 3 different ways the theory of planned behavior. And you can do that in different ways. And the problem is it results also in different outcomes. So we have a problem there. And I think this is a problem of the social sciences being not well integrated. If you follow the argument of, for example, Josh Epstein on generative social science, or for example, Andrzej Nowak, who's talking about a dynamical social psychology, I think it's about time that more social scientists focus on developing dynamical integrated models, and that is capable to connect basically cognitive levels with interaction levels and social network levels. And I have a very strong conviction that this is the way both to push forward the social science and making them integrated and focus on dynamics, as well making it into a more formal science that opens up connectivity with, for example, land use cases. That's what I wanted to share.
Thank you, Wander. So there's a lot of really great content in that question, Wander. And maybe can I open this up as a discussion amongst everyone here for a second and say, as you put this onus on the social scientists, are you suggesting that maybe there should be some gravitation towards some community efforts to develop community behavioral models and examples rather than social scientists working independently, who many are making strides to move in this direction, but differ from some of the levels of funding that the natural science acquires in order to build community models that are specific and more easily perhaps constrained by the natural sciences?
Well, I have a strong feeling that it also has a relation with a kind of paradigmatic change towards complexity science. So the underlying problems may be deeper than we often think. And if I talk with regular social scientists about complexity and the problems of validation and prediction, that are not the most easy discussions that I have in my life. And as I observe, the regular social sciences are not very open to agent-based applications. And it's very important to understand the reasons why they are often reluctant to consider this as a serious method. And I think that this signifies a problem that we have, I think.
Elke, what do you think about that? Do you think there's some restraint from being involved in this computational representation of behavioral theory?
I mean, there's so many interesting points that sort of Wander and also sort of Peter and you, Derek, sort of mentioned in the last 5 minutes or so. So I think, yes, I think sort of the answer to your specific question is yes. And I think sort of oftentimes for multiple reasons from different sources. I think one of them is, that sort of a lot of these agent-based models don't have closed form solutions, and so it's the mathematics that's unattractive. Then on top of that, yes, I think sort of a lot of social scientists feel that sort of it's hard to know what gives rise to certain patterns. So it's the opaqueness, and sort of the reading of tea leaves, that you're not quite sure how this comes about. That gets a little bit to Peter's point about sort of, and also yours, Wander, about the correlation versus causation. And the fact that for economics, basically is interested in equilibrium states. They're not interested in change. So that's noise. They wait until things equilibrate and then we predict it. And also they're not so much worried about correlations because they're trying to predict. They're not necessarily trying to intervene. But if you're trying to intervene in land use decisions or anything else, you better have a good causal model, because otherwise, so you might be wasting your time. I think then. Yeah, I'm sort of starting to ramble a little bit, but I think that the other thing is about this notion of complexity theory and complex adaptive systems. And that's basically now getting completely away from equilibrium states and saying that there's no equilibrium states. If we're lucky, we sort of are in a certain state for a while, but then tipping points happen and whatever, and everything evolves. And that's great in principle. It's not so easy to turn that into sort of models that explain certain phenomena locally, let alone globally. And I think the other thing, sort of the other general comment I wanted to make is we have to sort of figure out what are we trying to do. If we're trying to come up with global maps of global phenomena, then maybe sort of these, the simple story, Peter, that evolves from your enterprise about sort of moving from subsistence, to market based phenomena, and then the environmental thing comes in as a luxury when you have sort of satisfied certain kind of needs. Maybe that simple story is fine at that level of granularity, And then to also ask on top of that, to have something that explains global phenomena. On top of that, sort of also getting more complex. Maybe that's asking for too much. So maybe we have to pick our battles and figure out what kind of approaches are most useful and when not.
I just want to ask both Peter and Elke if you have time to continue talking for 10 more minutes, as I believe we're reaching our time limit. If so, then we'll continue the conversation for 10 more minutes. Yes? Okay, thank you. Peter, your text note agrees with Vonder's question. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Basically, I think Vonder is correct. There is, from different traditions, a resistance to move further, and I think the result of those problems that you sketch is that we're dealing now and base a lot of our global assessments on models that do not represent those complexities at all. And that's continuously, I think, the balance we have to strike. It is incredibly difficult to translate these kind of decision making into computational models. And we often start using heuristics, and 3 people building that, and you get 3 different models. That's a big problem. Tatjana has shown that, and we know it. We know, and that's a big problem of agent-based modeling based on heuristics. And that has been the huge success of equilibrium modeling, profit optimization algorithms, because those are straightforward mechanisms. And also in my modeling, I still use those mechanisms because you can reproduce them, they're clear. But we know they're imperfect, so we need to make those steps beyond that. And it takes different efforts. It takes different attempts in comparing those different implementations. And that gives us some notion of the uncertainty, because now there's no uncertainty visible, but we know it's wrong. I think also Elke showed on the climate behavior an example of we have to start quantifying what is the impact of accounting for those things or not. And it will be imperfect. We have to make steps and not let us being fit to our traditions. And the answer is in between causality and empirical analysis. That's an old science philosophy debate, which is not very productive. We all know we need both approaches to move further. And I think that's what we're trying to do here. And today was an example. I really think we need to make advances both on the theoretical side as well as on the empirical side, both at local scales as well as trying to generalize across those skills to learn again.
Well, as the moderator here, I think you guys have convinced me that I should be giving a voice to our contestants and not trying to summarize them and missing the context. So I want to open up the next question to Oliver Perkins as opposed to delivering it for him.
Hi, this is Lauren. I'm actually having trouble unmuting him. I'm not sure why.
No, it's all right. I'm here. Thanks so much, Peter. That was great. You kind of touched on my question when you were discussing the role of government and institutional actors, and the fact that you couldn't, you didn't feel basically that you could do it from secondary data, although that wasn't going to be a particularly effective approach. I just wondered if you had any ideas about, because you mentioned in your final slide that the data is kind of minimal, if you had any ideas about how you might go about doing that, whether in statistical or process-based modeling?
I think it's a good question. There are ways of moving ahead. As some were mentioned in the chat, I'm trying to use information from crowdsourcing knowledge. This map of the large-scale land acquisition is also kind of a crowdsourcing product. There is big attempts to map value chains, actors, how they impact on different places. There are patterns found that certain value chain actors, traders, are behaving differently in different regions depending on the governance and the context. They organize themselves in different places. So we can use those techniques to move ahead and trying to map out the diversity in those situations to also understand what can be happening where and understanding that network. And there will be a lot of gaps in all of that, but we're moving slowly ahead. And I think that it's always land governance and how this is organized has been a little bit of an issue that has always been attributed to the political scientists that do wonderful work on that, but are not having a tradition of mapping that out in space and quantifying those things. So again, there we have to bridge disciplines to see how we can also get that into some numbers that we can work with, into maps of where are those constructs like contract farming, where are they getting big? Because they change the game. And also in terms, because that's the question of, okay, why are we doing this? Why are we building these models? Because you don't model to make a model. You want to give a hands-on how you can intervene in the system, how you can make different policies, how you can address them. So we need to know what's happening where in that sense, in order to target interventions at the right place, in the right system. Because you can target very nice campaigns to smallholders. Well, if all the smallholders have signed a contract to do certain things with a big trader, you're addressing the wrong agent. So I think it's more than about modeling, that we try to better understand how these things are working.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Peter. We have time for 2 more questions. And I think there's one name that invokes thoughts in all of us that are involved in land use modeling. And Bill McConnell, I'd like to give you an opportunity to ask your question and bring this person to the forefront.
Yeah, thank you. At the risk of being impolite, Gil always asks this question in a much more humorous way than I'm going to be able to, but how are we doing in terms of the success of the models?
And Bill's referring to Gil Pontius, who many of us know has a number of publications that tests our ability to add predictive capacity from our models and to beat a null model of existing persistence in a landscape while we're trying to simulate change and ensure that our change that we simulate is providing a better outcome than the persistent situation, for those of you who aren't familiar with his work. And so I think this question is directed to you, Peter. Oh, you might be muted. Lauren, can you unmute Peter, please? Or Peter, can you try to unmute yourself? Or maybe this is a technical difficulty because you don't want to answer this question.
I tried to escape the question, but now I can. We cannot validate because we didn't really model and just change these things. But the good news is, I think our patterns and our goodness of fit at least indicate that globally diversity of decision making is very important, and is really the no model being no diversity in decision making and all rational choice or equilibrium assumptions on profit optimization. I think our results indicate that clearly that's we can prove that that's not correct. But yeah, this is not really dynamic modeling yet. So.
And so with the variation that we get from the inclusion of diversity, at least that is going to help us consider alternative outcomes that we might not have considered if we had a blanket representation of decision making or of land use change that could guide us to advanced science. Is that where you're going with that, Peter? Or am I just making that up? Okay, we've got time for, oh, you're muted. Okay, we've got time for one more question here from Vivek Georgia. Vivek, do you have the microphone access now?
Yeah. My question is, there is emphasis about a positive emphasis about heuristics from Gigerenzer, saying that heuristics are adaptive toolboxes. So I wanted to ask Elke how receptive climate science specialists about heuristics, taking at least certain varieties of heuristics as much useful for any specific decision context. Are they receptive? Whether if they are receptive, whether we could extend the similar kind of positive notion towards heuristics to the land use models. Is it possible? And my second question to Peter is, thanks a lot for your presentation. This is the first time I came to know about your meta-analysis paper. My question is, most of the decision-making papers are quantitative or qualitative. I'll go through your paper, but out of curiosity, I'm just asking it here. Thank you very much.
Elke? Lauren, can you unmute Elke, please? Thank you.
Okay. So, Vivek, the answer to your question about heuristics, of course, is yes. And so when I talk, for example, about rule-based decisions in these sort of tripartite way of decision modes, or for that matter, even affect-based decisions, I mean, yeah, those two are very much heuristic ways of processing, doing what everybody else is doing, for example, like imitation as heuristic. That comes out of looking at the descriptive norm. What is everybody else doing? And I'm going to copy that. Or sort of following your gut level feeling. If something is great, I approach. If something is scary, I back off. I very much think about those as heuristic ways of processing. And even some of the calculation-based modes that take shortcuts, I think sort of would also fall in that category. So yes, I think that's just a different label, I think, applied to decision.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
And Peter, can you address the content of some of the context of the studies that you've looked at in your meta-analysis as to if they're quantitative and qualitative? Is that correct, Vivek?
Most of these studies were very qualitative, very descriptive, and we semi-quantify that by basically we use some coding schemes like on the different objectives by dividing 10 points amongst the objectives based on the description. Some studies were more quantitative where we could use the quantitative base to do that. And we did all the kind of the standard approaches of having different coders divide the points to see consistency in the things. But there is in that interpretation, because we wanted to have, because the base of real quantitative studies is very small at the moment, and there's many more around the literature for specific measures like adoption of crops, adoption of sustainable practices. There's much more behavioral quantitative studies available where you can do a real meta-analysis, where you can quantify the effect sizes. But for this broader study to be able to incorporate enough studies that cover the globe, we were not able to only select the quantitative ones because it was fairly insufficient. And especially those have also been done in a very biased way, often in the developing context rather than developing worlds where there's more anthropologist style descriptive studies in the developing context. So there is a huge difference and huge style difference across the different continents of the studies we had in our group of studies. And in fact, that was the most important, most interesting part of the whole exercise, was going through all those different studies of land use change in localities and how different it is in our communities, how we do those studies. And there's huge biases because even economists goes to the field to describe what's happening in a certain case study. It's a different story you get probably when you send in an anthropologist. So there is biases in those things.
My interest is there any possibility for us to see any methodology paper, like methodology recommendations from arising out of this meta-analysis, understanding where are drawbacks, where are positives are there, how we could build newer studies, any methodological guidelines?
Okay, guys.
I would very much, that's a nice closing remark there. I would very much argue that more work like Elke has been presenting on really trying to quantify and doing rigid experiments on decision making would really help in structuring this type of research.
Well, I'd like to thank you both on behalf of the 60+ visitors that chimed in for this talk today. And it was a great kickoff and you guys have set the bar high. If you could join me in a round of applause for our speakers. The steering committee for the large-scale behavioral group is comprised of Maya Schluter, Birgit Mueller, Tatiana Filatova, Mark Roundseville, Callan Brown, and myself. And we are always looking for new members and suggestions for additional topics. So stay tuned for our future webinars. And again, thank you both for your insights today.